Welcome to this review of Unit 6, which will be about industrialization, urbanization, and westward expansion. After the Civil War, the southern states, as they regained control over their states from the Republicans, began to enact what were called Jim Crow laws. These laws created a second-class citizenship for African Americans, primarily in the form of segregating Black Americans from white Americans, so that in public places, Black folk cannot share bathrooms, theater spaces, drinking fountains with white folks. In the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision, the Supreme Court ruled that these Jim Crow laws were constitutional. Separate but equal facilities were in fact legal and do not violate the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So this gave legal constitutional protection to the idea of Jim Crow. Later, in the 1910s up until the 1930s, many African Americans, in response to the conditions they were experiencing, but also in the hope of getting new jobs, will move to northern cities like Cleveland, Detroit, and New York. This great migration is not just a response to Jim Crow and violence by Southerners, but it's also a response to the economic conditions of sharecropping, where African Americans get trapped, usually in perpetual debt, and never able to escape and own their own land. And the North will have jobs for them, particularly wartime jobs during World War I. One of the African Americans in this era who leads a crusade against the violence done to African Americans is a woman named Ida B. Wells, who came from Tennessee. She witnessed the lynching of her friends and then launched a crusade to document what was happening to African Americans and speak about it. Her anti-lynching crusade eventually led her to have to leave the South as African Americans like her and others demanded the federal government take action. Now, they won't do anything, the federal government won't do anything until after World War II. But at this point, she is speaking about it and addressing it. Another African American who wanted to help African Americans deal with the problems of Jim Crow and racism was Booker T. Washington. His philosophy is known as racial uplift, the idea that African Americans have to work hard, lift themselves up, better their race. And the way to do that, the way to achieve equality, was through an education. If you achieve an education and economic success, white Americans will respect you. Booker T, in advocating this position, accepted segregation. He accepted the notion that African Americans and white Americans could be separated by race, as long as Black Americans worked hard as mechanics, farmers, and bricklayers, and all kinds of other jobs. He felt that one day white people might earn or might give the African Americans the respect they deserve, but African Americans would need to work for it. Another African American who responded to Jim Crow was William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. Du Bois believed that education was important, but not at the expense of equality. African Americans deserved equality even if they weren't educated. So he believed in lifting up African Americans through learning and through training, not just for bricklaying and mechanics and farming, but through higher degrees like becoming a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher. He is one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which would bring a lot of attention to Jim Crow laws and would sue in order to get these discriminatory laws overturned. He became a leading figure in the fight for African American rights in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the South, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the big issue there is the South industrializing and becoming a new South, as African Americans are struggling to maintain any semblance of political power and social power and economic power in the wake of the failure of Reconstruction. And there are two responses to Southern trends by African Americans. The response of Booker T. Washington, which is to say African Americans should work hard, they should train themselves in some skills. Eventually, one day, white people would come to accept them. And as part of that bargain, African Americans needed to accept segregation. It was just going to be the way that African Americans would survive. Not everyone agreed with Booker T. Washington's point of view. W.E.B. Du Bois, in fact, challenged Booker T's arguments, saying that with Jim Crow segregation, with all of the disenfranchisement that African Americans experienced, accepting segregation was never going to result in any positive benefits. In fact, African Americans would need to demand respect and to fight that system in order to achieve full equality. In the same time period as Jim Crow laws are being written, many Americans are moving west. The Civil War ends in 1865, and during that war, Republicans had passed a Homestead Act, which would offer free public land in the West to anyone who would move there, live on the land, and farm it for 5 years. So the cost of this would be fairly low for people. You just got to make sure you get out there, have supplies, build a house and farm. And that would allow lots of Americans the opportunity to make a new life for themselves. Some African Americans also responded to this call to move west. So in 1879 and 1880, many African Americans went to Kansas. These were known as the exodusters. They were escaping Southern racism, Jim Crow laws, and mistreatment to also build a new life for themselves in the West. Getting to the West was made a lot easier by technology. One of the most important pieces of technology would be the railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad opens in 1869. And that allows people to get to all the way to the west, to the Pacific, a lot easier than going by wagon, by horse, by foot. Also in the West, farming, making a life via farming, is made easier by the increasing use of equipment like mechanical reapers and other harvesting equipment. This will make it easier to produce farm goods and link farmers back to eastern markets where they can sell the grains and other products they grow. But this came at a cost to the native peoples who lived in the West. Natives, American Indians, were forced onto reservations in this time period in order to get land from them and give it to white folks. And then later, the U.S. government passed something known as the Dawes Act to try and get Indians to imitate white farming and live on 160-acre plots. And that was an attempt to, quote unquote, civilize these Indians and turn them into white farmers. It actually resulted in natives losing a lot of their land. Approximately 90 million acres are taken from native peoples in this time period. Another effect of all of this increased farming in the West is the overproduction of crops. And the more people produce, the lower the price. In this time period after the Civil War, migration to America also increases as Europeans want to escape war, political and religious persecution, and bad economic situations. Before 1871, most of the people who came to the Americas were known as the old immigrants. They were Germans, they were Irish people, they were from Britain, and so they were known to Americans as these are the people we know that are migrants. But that will change after 1871, when more and more of the migrants will be from places like Italy, Germany, Poland, Russia, China, and Japan. These new immigrants will be seen as quite different from the old immigrants. Another big influence in this time period is migration. As America industrializes, as Americans move west, there is a lot of opportunity seen for migrants coming to the United States. Migration is, of course, not new. We have the old migration of the 1840s and 50s, which was German and Irish and resulted in a nativist political movement known as the Know-Nothings. In the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s, there's a second migration, the new immigrants, and they are more from Eastern and Southern Europe as well as Asia. And we get the same nativist response to these guys, the fear that America will be swept over by migrants who will take over everything. And so the response to that is to try to Americanize them and help them fit into American society through settlement houses. But there's also another response where urban political machines harness or utilize the votes of these migrants to maintain political power. These new migrants came for jobs. So for example, the Chinese and the Irish labored to build the Transcontinental Railroad. They would work in textile and steel mills, places like Pittsburgh. They made clothes in the garment trades, often doing a lot of the sewing in their homes. They worked in coal mines, and they worked in very poor conditions. There was low pay in this time period. It's an average about $500 a year. Hours, 12 to 14-hour days, and very dangerous safety conditions. In this time period, there are approximately about 10,000 factory explosions that resulted in horrific deaths for many of these workers. Because many of these migrants were seen as very different, culturally different, languages different, religions different, they were looked at with a good bit of suspicion. Americans wanted the migrants to assimilate, to get into the melting pot of American culture and then lose their immigrant identities. But many of the migrants settled in ethnic neighborhoods, which is why we have Italian village, German village, we have a Hungarian village. You'll see a Chinatown in other towns. And that meant that the migrants often lived apart from other Americans and were able to keep parts of their culture, adopt some elements of American culture that made them able to survive and be successful. So the assimilation of these natives wasn't exactly like a melting pot. They didn't melt and lose their identities completely. Public schools often helped the children of immigrants to assimilate by teaching them English and American culture. But there were also organizations like settlement houses, founded by Jane Addams in Chicago. Hull House is a famous example, which would not only help the poor in cities, but also would provide classes for migrants. So migrants, adult migrants, immigrants could learn to speak English, could learn how to shake hands like Americans, dress like an American, and conduct business like an American. Still, many Americans were afraid of these migrants, that these migrants would be disease-ridden, or they would be radicals from Europe who would destroy American life and culture. Some Americans thought that immigrants were anarchists and would overthrow America's government. A lot of these fears were based on religious differences. Americans looked at Catholic migrants and Jewish migrants with a great deal of suspicion because they didn't look at their religion as being valid. Language differences made it hard to communicate. And so the more Russian speakers, Yiddish speakers, Polish speakers, Greek speakers, Italian speakers who come in, Americans don't understand those languages. Competition for jobs is probably one of the biggest reasons for fear, because the more migrants who come, that's more people trying to compete for the same jobs. And Americans want those jobs and don't want migrants to take them. A lot of these fears resulted in laws to try to ban migration. So in 1882, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned almost all Chinese immigrants coming to the US for 10 years. Immigrants lived in ethnic neighborhoods in very, very poor conditions as cities grew rapidly. And the cities growing quickly meant that cities were often overwhelmed with sanitation problems, trash removal problems. The immigrants would live in really dirty tenement houses, which are just apartment houses that were crowded. It's estimated that there are about 700 people per acre in one part of New York. And an acre is roughly the size of a football field. That's a lot of people sharing space. So fires break out, diseases break out, there's a lot of crime. Murder rate increases 300% after the Civil War, and transportation problems as the cities just grow sort of chaotically. In this chaos, we often find urban bosses who were political leaders who were corrupt. These corrupt political bosses would often use immigrant labor and immigrant help in order to maintain their power. So if you were an immigrant and voted for the boss would take care of you by providing some limited welfare. The boss would make sure that good jobs went to the boss's supporters. So in many ways, boss rule was kind of like an early welfare system, but it was incredibly corrupt and resulted in millions of dollars being stolen from taxpayers. After the Civil War is a time of incredible industrial and technological growth as well. Many Americans invent lots of inventions that we take for granted today. So the light bulb, the telephone, the airplane, the car, the typewriter. Many of these inventions dramatically reshape American life, increasing our ability to communicate, our ability to move across space and get from place to place, our ability to light up our homes and work long after darkness has settled in. And the US government allows these inventors to patent their inventions. So you can file a patent with the government, and the government will protect your right to that invention. This is the time period of the greatest industrial leaders of American history, giants, men who are so wealthy and so powerful that they're even more powerful than the US government. These men are some of the richest leaders of American history. They're often called robber barons because of their wealth and power. Men like Andrew Carnegie, who controlled steel, J.P. Morgan, who was a banker and financier, John D. Rockefeller, who controlled oil, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, who controlled railroads. These men are some of the wealthiest and most powerful business leaders of American history. The reason that these robber barons were able to grow so rich and so powerful is because of a lot of factors. One was that the U.S. government didn't really stop them. This is known as laissez-faire capitalism, the idea that the government will remain hands-off for business. It won't interfere with business growth. In fact, in many ways, the U.S. government will help businesses grow and will protect these robber barons from all kinds of problems. There are special laws that are passed to benefit business. So for example, there are land grants to railroads, so we give the railroads land. We don't give that land to other people, except for farmers under the Homestead Act. We will do protective tariffs to protect industries in this time period. Another reason for the growth of these businesses will be cheap immigrant labor. America possesses a vast amount of natural resources: coal, gold, copper, silver, iron. We have navigable rivers, so we've got a country with a lot of natural resources that we can exploit. And finally, being rich and powerful in this time period is a sign that God favors you. The Gospel of Wealth, written by Andrew Carnegie, says that riches are a sign of God's favor, and that the rich should use that wealth on the behalf of the poor, because that's what God wants. Inequality is natural. We can't all be rich, we can't all be powerful, but at least the rich, the robber barons, can take care of the poor by providing them schools, libraries. Another idea that promotes this power of the robber barons is known as social Darwinism. And it's the belief that the only people who survive are the most fit. Clearly, Andrew Carnegie is the most fit. He beat all the other steel producers. He's the best. So he deserves what he has earned. In the AP exam, you will see probably some reference to Supreme Court cases in the 19th century. Not necessarily directly, maybe in the SAQs and the DBQs and LAQs, you could refer to these cases. The cases are lots of different directions. So there's a cluster of cases that are pro-business and pro-business growth. Dartmouth College, for example, is a good one. Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge. U.S. versus E.C. Knight is a set of cases that are very pro-business. Another set of cases will grant powers to the Supreme Court and the federal government. So a great example of that is Marbury versus Madison. McCulloch versus Maryland will be an example. Gibbons versus Ogden. And the last cluster of cases are about the rights of citizens, specifically African Americans. Dred Scott is an example of a case that denies citizenship to the enslaved and African Americans. The civil rights cases of the 1880s says that the 14th Amendment can't be applied to private companies at the state level, so it won't protect African Americans from discrimination. And then finally, Plessy versus Ferguson allows for the segregation of African Americans in the 19th century. So those three clusters could show up on the AP exam. Cluster 1, pro-business cases. Cluster 2, pro-federal power cases. And Cluster 3, anti-civil rights for African Americans cases. In the late 19th century, we will see the rise of movements to try to challenge the power of the robber barons, and one is led by farmers. This is known as the populist movement. In the 1880s, farmers organized to fight railroads. That was their enemy number one. And they wanted demand-free silver, which meant increasing the money supply in the United States. They would make more silver coins. In 1896, a Democrat by the name of William Jennings Bryan gave a speech famously known as the Cross of Gold speech, criticizing the bankers and the railroads and people who supported gold. He wanted free silver. He wasn't a populist, but he spoke populist language, and he ran for president and lost. Ultimately, the populists don't really get what they want in the 1880s and 1890s, but many of their ideas, like directly electing senators and regulating railroads, will become law later. So populists aren't successful in the short term, but a lot of their ideas are successful in the long term. The populists are part of movements to fix capitalism in the late 19th century. Movements that are trying to challenge the power of the robber barons. So for example, the social gospel is a movement of Christians to try to bring Christianity to the streets and address social injustice and poverty. We can, as Christians, fix these issues that are created by the business practices of the robber barons. The gospel of wealth is also a movement to kind of fix capitalism while also defending capitalism at the same time. Andrew Carnegie and other industrialists become more philanthropic, giving their money away in order to achieve a better social position. So they will build hospitals and schools and libraries, so people will look at them and say, oh, see, they're rich, but they also give their money to help the poor. The federal government will also try to limit the abuses of capitalism by passing an antitrust law and regulating railroads. This is the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Act, 1890 and 1887. Both of the acts were not really enforced. So trying to regulate railroads and trying to regulate monopolies didn't work out in the 19th century, but it will work out later when we get to the progressives. And finally, the populists are another movement to try to challenge the power of capitalism, and that is a movement of farmers and workers to say we'll take over railroads, regulate banks, print more currency, more silver. They try to launch a political party, and their ideas get stolen by a Democrat named William Jennings Bryan. But they fail to take over the US government in the 1890s. So many of their ideas will take place later, like electing senators directly, an income tax, regulating railroads. But in the short term, they don't get what they want. And that's our look at America after the Civil War.